Well, hey everybody, welcome to North Shore. If you're wondering why I'm not there, it's because I'm here, on a plane. Now, like many of you, I haven't spent that much time on a plane in the last 18 months, so being here brings up a ton of memories. Trips I've taken, places I've traveled, flight delays I've suffered. But for me, flying really changed when we had kids. I used to travel light. I could fit everything I needed into a small carry-on and get through security in just a few seconds. Now, I show up to the airport with a double stroller, 2 car seats, a large duffel bag, another large duffel bag, a diaper bag, a toy bag, a snack bag, and lots of crying. Mostly from me. I used to feel bad for that guy at the airport. Now, I am that guy at the airport. So now, when I do travel on my own, I sometimes settle down into what someone once called a cone of non-interaction. In other words, I put my headphones in, I've got my Kindle out. My whole vibe screams, do not disturb, which is an introvert's dream, right? And kind of an extrovert's target. One time when I was traveling internationally, I was trying to fall asleep against the window when the person next to me started to tap me on the shoulder. He said, "Hey, sorry to bother you, but I'm traveling with a friend who's sitting across the aisle. Would you mind trading seats with him?" Which normally wouldn't be a big deal. But when I looked over at his friend, I saw he didn't have an aisle or a window seat. He had a middle seat where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And I think he could tell I wasn't that excited to move, so he said, "How about this? I'll give you $100 to switch seats." Now, as a pastor, I immediately felt this surge of guilt to think that I would need to be paid to live out the kind of sacrificial generosity that I tell people to live out all the time. And I could sense God saying to me, "Scotty, just do the right thing. Do the right thing." So I did what I thought was best. I took his money and I switched seats. And God was watching because I didn't sleep a lick on that flight. Which turned out to be kind of a blessing in disguise, you see. Because that opened the door for another conversation that I still remember today. The young man sitting next to me was also flying home to the U.S. And I asked him what he did for a living. He said he was a software engineer. He asked what I did for a living. I said I was a pastor. And he paused for a second and looked at me like I just told him that I believe in the tooth fairy. And part of me wanted to say, I don't just believe in the tooth fairy, I work for the guy. But we went on to have this amazing conversation. And he had some pretty negative experiences at church. I know some of you may be able to relate to that. He had some really strong opinions about religion and God and its impact on the world. And I don't think he'd ever talked to a pastor because he had lots of questions. At some point, I told him that I still have lots of questions too. And he said, "I didn't know pastors were allowed to have questions." I said, "Well, they do at my church. In fact, that's what I love so much about Jesus. He can handle my questions and my faults and even my failures. In fact, that's what his life on earth was all about, redeeming mine." And to my surprise, he wasn't offended. He was actually genuinely intrigued. It was an amazing conversation that I still remember, and I like to believe that he does too. Now, the problem with that conversation isn't what I said or didn't say. The problem is that far too often, in situations like that, I don't say anything. Or I just kind of settle for small talk. And not just when I travel, but when I'm in a coffee shop, or in line at the store, or walking through my neighborhood. You see, the spiritual conversations I regret most are the ones I didn't have. So, we're starting a new series this weekend called Real Talk, about how to have delightful and respectful conversations about God. Because a lot of people I know think talking about God's kind of a pesky or even pushy thing to do. And I imagine that's especially true for those of you who are just exploring faith. Maybe you've had some not so delightful experiences with Christians who may have treated you more like a project than a person. But that's not what this series is about. This is about how we can have more normal, humble, and even joyful conversations about what matters most in life. And by the way, if you're not a follower of Jesus, I'm so glad you're here. I hope you take lots of notes so you can help the Christians you know learn to do this a little better. But before we get into how to do this, I want to remind you why we do this. And it can be summed up in 2 words: good news. You see, the story of Jesus at its core, it's good news. In fact, the word gospel, some of you know that word, is derived from the Anglo-Saxon term Godspell, which means good story. The story of Jesus is a good story about the fact that you are loved by God and you've been made for a purpose and you're not alone and you can find forgiveness and there's always, always hope. Some of you have heard me say this before, but the good news about the good news is that it's still good news when there's no good news. Now, for some of you, that may sound a little surprising because you've heard or come to believe that Christianity is based on kind of bad news. That the world is a mess and suffering is everywhere and people can be hypocritical, judgmental, resentful, and unreliable. But here's the thing. You don't need Christianity to know that. You just need to be awake. Better yet, the story of Jesus is the good news that God has an answer for all that. When Jesus came into the world and gave his life for you and for me. And this story, it's not just a good story, it's a true story. I mean, Jesus isn't a legend, he's a historical person. And the Bible is not a collection of religious sayings, it's a collection of real events, including the life, death, and resurrection of this man, Jesus. And if you ever wondered if the first followers of Jesus just made all that up, just remember that most of them were mocked, mistreated, and many were killed for their claims. And yes, people die for what they believe, but no one gives up their life for what they know to be a lie. And by the way, the impact of the story is even more undeniable. I mean, think about it. How is it that a man who was executed as a criminal started the fastest growing faith movement in history? Or how is it that a man who was supposedly dead and buried has brought people together from every background and belief and nation? I mean, I looked online and I found just about every kind of group for Jesus. There are Jews for Jesus, Muslims for Jesus, moms for Jesus, cowboys for Jesus, clowns for Jesus, even atheists for Jesus. I don't even know how that group's possible. The story of Jesus, it's a good story, and it's a true story, which means it's a shareable story. The prophet Isaiah, a long time ago, once wrote these words. He said, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation." In other words, good news isn't just something we need to hear. It's something we're meant to tell. Not because you feel guilty or because you've heard me give a message on it, but simply because it's such good news. And by the way, that's not a spiritual or religious kind of thing. This is true about any good news. For example, when Nina and I got engaged, we didn't just keep it to ourselves. I'd arranged for all of our friends to be back at my house to share in the good news. By the way, which meant there was no plan B if she said no. But thankfully, she didn't. She said yes. And I surprised her with a house full of people ready to celebrate the good news. Because good news, it's meant to be shared. And the same is true with the story of Jesus. When he was born, an angel told a group of shepherds, "I bring you good news." After the shepherds found Jesus, they told other people about him. Years later, a man named Andrew found Jesus, and then he told his brother Simon. And then when a man named Philip found Jesus, he told his friend Nathanael. Noticing a pattern yet? In the Bible, people that find Jesus share Jesus because good news is just meant to be shared. And because they believe that other people needed to hear it. They really believe that. Apostle Paul once wrote these words. He said, "How can people believe in him, Jesus, if they never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them?" Answer, they can't. The only way people can know the story is when someone shares the story, which is actually happening less and less in our day. There's a great little book about this called The Reluctant Witness. We're using it throughout this series. And the book cites new research from the Barna Group that shows that between the years 1993 and today, the percentage of Christians who feel called to share their faith has dropped from 89% to 64%. Not only that, the percentage of Christians who have told people about the benefits of following Jesus has dropped from 78% to 50%. I mean, that represents millions of conversations that could have happened, but they didn't happen. And I'm not just pointing the finger at you. Over that same time frame, the percentage of Christians who say their church has done a really good job of helping them talk about Jesus has dropped from 77% to 57%. So that's not about how you're doing. That's about how I'm doing. And the most common reason that people give for avoiding these kinds of conversations is fear. Fear of offending someone, fear of being mocked or rejected, fear of the consequences either relationally or maybe professionally, and fear always turns sharing into silence. Some of you know that old saying, the cat's got your tongue. Ever heard of that one? Ever wonder where that phrase comes from? Some etymologists actually believe it goes back to the English Navy and how prisoners were always silent after they'd been flogged with a whip called the cat of nine tails. The cat got their tongue. Others believe it can be traced back to the fear of witches and their cats. Well, no one's really certain, but clearly the cats are the bad guys in all this. But when it comes to talking about Jesus, the cats often got my tongue, even as a pastor. I mean, I can worry too much about what other people think or not wanting to be misunderstood. And I'm guessing I'm not the only one who's felt fear around this. I mean, even the disciple Peter, you may know his story. He was the most outspoken follower of Jesus, but he denied knowing Jesus because of fear. The cat really got his tongue. And maybe you can relate to that. Maybe talking about God for you feels risky or pushy or even scary because you don't want to offend anyone and you don't want to be labeled. Or maybe because you've been hurt by how other people have shared about their faith with you. Maybe you felt attacked or judged or, kind of rebuked or criticized more than you felt known or loved. And it's not just fear or bad experiences that have changed how we talk about God in our day. The world around us has changed. I mean, people today aren't sitting around thinking about how to find forgiveness for their sins. And more people are speaking out against Christianity, not because it's illogical or untrue, because they see it as oppressive or maybe even dangerous, which means we're living in a day when the good news is simply assumed to be bad news. But just so you know, this isn't the first time this has happened. The early church lived in a setting that was far more hostile and far more opposed. And yet, the good news of Jesus, the story of Jesus, spread faster and further in those early centuries than in any other time in history. And by the way, it happened one conversation at a time. So, how can that happen again in our day? How can we tell the story in a context like ours? We're going to be unpacking that over the next few weeks. We're going to talk about some of the myths and misconceptions about spiritual conversations, as well as what not to do. But today, I want to give you 4 simple and very practical steps that can help you get started. So you ready? Step 1, start more conversations. Just start more conversations. When you're on a plane, or waiting in line at the store, or taking your dog for a walk. Sure, not starting conversations will help you avoid having that awkward conversations, but it will also guarantee that you'll never have that life-changing conversation. So, start more conversations. And Jesus did this all the time. He once approached a tax collector named Matthew and said, "Follow me," just to start a conversation. He turned to a fisherman named Peter and said, "Cast your nets into deep water," to start a conversation. He walked up to someone who was suffering from paralysis and said, "Do you want to get well?" to start a conversation. He reached down to a woman who had been caught in adultery and said, "Where are your condemners now?" to start a conversation. Sometimes, all God needs us to do to start a miracle is start a conversation. Now, I can imagine that those of you who are more extroverted are already feeling really excited about this, while the introverts are thinking, "I need to find a new church." But this isn't about being more extroverted. It's about recognizing that God will allow us to cross paths with people who need good news. Maybe there's someone in your neighborhood who you just kind of keep bumping into. Or maybe there's someone at your school or your work that you've gotten to know. Or maybe you see the same faces at the gym or the grocery store or the mall. I mean, don't let this become more complicated than it needs to be. Just ask God to open your eyes to one person this week and start one conversation that you wouldn't otherwise have. That's step 1. Start more conversations. Step 2. Listen before you speak. Listen before you speak. This past week, I read about a study on doctor-patient interactions. And one of the findings was that a patient, on average, had 18 seconds to explain his or her problem before the doctor would start to formulate a solution. Just 18 seconds. Which got me thinking how quickly I can jump in or even interrupt another person with my perspective or my solutions. But the Bible teaches us to do just the opposite when interacting with other people. The writer James in the New Testament says, "Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak." That means we listen first and speak later. And this is really crucial because how you start a conversation determines how well it goes. In fact, John Gottman, who's a relationship expert and researcher, said that the very first minute of a conversation sets the tone for everything that follows. So if you're too quick to talk about you or your views, you're not likely to make a deeper connection. But if you're genuinely interested in the other person, they will be more interested in you. It's part of what's called the rule of reciprocity, which just means how you interact with someone else will determine how they interact with you. So if you want someone to listen to you, you have to listen to them. If you want someone to be curious about what you believe, you have to be curious about what they believe. Some years ago, I started having conversations with a friend of mine who was an outspoken atheist. And no matter how well I presented my beliefs or the reasons for them, he just seemed to grow even more and more opposed to faith. So I took a different strategy. I started just asking more questions. I started listening to his stories. And over time, get this, I learned that his objections to faith weren't based solely on intellectual reasons, but on painful experiences from his childhood. In other words, I came to understand not just what he believed, but why he believed it. And that opened the door for deeper and more loving interactions. You see, seeking to understand another person also involves learning to anticipate how they're going to respond to what you say. In fact, research has found that most interpersonal conflict is actually based on our inability to anticipate how another person will respond to our words. Quick example of this. When Nina and I were first married, we would get into arguments, and I would say things like, "But honey, I didn't mean for that to hurt your feelings." Or, "Babe, you're just not seeing the situation correctly." Any guesses on how that went over? Not very well, right? She interpreted all that as me being defensive and not taking her feelings seriously, which looking back was kind of true. But I also wasn't yet able to anticipate how my words would impact our conversations. So I had to start answering certain questions before the conversations. Things like, how does she feel about this? And why does she feel that way? And how might she respond if I disagree? And the more I anticipated how she would hear me, the more helpful our conversations actually became. And the same is true when it comes to conversations about God. So listen first. Seek to understand, not convince. Anticipate how they might respond. That's step 2. Step 3, find common ground. You're going to have to find common ground. When the Apostle Paul traveled to the great Greek city of Athens, he saw all the idols in the city, but he didn't start by saying, "You've got all the wrong gods. What are you doing here?" He started by establishing common ground. He said, "I see you are very religious." In other words, I see you're a lot like me. You're looking for answers. Me too. You're seeking the truth. Me too. Now, your idol says God is someone you don't know, and my God is someone you can know, but it's amazing how much we have in common. See, Paul built his entire argument on common ground. He affirmed part of their perspective without condoning the whole thing. But unfortunately, far too many people in the church today do just the opposite. We begin conversations thinking, we're completely different, and we're right and you're wrong. We're holy and you're not. We're going to heaven and, well, you seem to be headed kind of in the other direction. Rather than realizing we share a lot in common with people who may hold very different kinds of beliefs. We want many of the same things out of life, don't we? And we face many of the same questions and challenges in life. Like, how can I find real joy? Or how do I respond to suffering or injustice? Or is there any greater purpose to this life? See, in order to be respectful about how we might answer these questions differently, we have to start with what we actually hold in common. And by the way, it's our inability to do this in this current political climate that's created such a toxic and seemingly impossible divide in this country, you know? It's not because conservatives are so much more conservative or liberals are so much more liberal. It's because we no longer start with what we have in common. And we only hear about how much we disagree. And we're not seeing this just in politics, but in public health, education, public safety, and the church as well. But Jesus gives us another way. He starts with common ground. For example, he once approached a publicly disgraced Samaritan woman near a well. She couldn't have been more different in her background, her behavior, her beliefs. But Jesus still found common ground. He said, "Give me something to drink." In other words, I get thirsty too. I need water too. I'm a human being too. And the conversation that followed changed her life forever. But it never would have happened if Jesus didn't find common ground. In fact, the entire story of Jesus, think about it, is about a God who became a human being. It's the story of a God who was willing to find common ground even with his fallen creation. And this step, it can help you navigate hard conversations in your marriage or in a friendship or with a colleague at work. Because when you start with what you hold in common, you'll be able to navigate where you differ in an entirely different way. So start more conversations. Listen before you speak. Find common ground. And then fourth and finally, tell the story of what God has done in you. Because you see, none of these other steps will really matter if you're unwilling to share how God's love has changed your heart or restored a relationship or given you guidance. I'm not talking about giving a lesson from the Bible. I'm talking about being vulnerable about your life because God can use that. I mean, just think for a moment about the worst sermon you've ever heard. Don't look at me like it's this one. I mean, I'm on a plane. It can't be that bad. Tell you, the worst sermon I've ever heard was given by a man named Jonah in the Bible. If you know his story, Jonah refused to go to a city called Nineveh because he thought the city was too sinful and the people were too prideful. So he tried to get away on a boat. If it were today, he would have boarded a plane. But the boat ran into a great storm or great turbulence, and they ended up throwing him overboard, which is where the plane analogy kind of breaks down. So then he finally goes to Nineveh, but it was clear he didn't care about those people because he gave literally the worst sermon ever. He said, and I quote, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. That's it. No opening story, no humorous illustrations. He doesn't even use the word God. Just 40 days and you're all toast. Now, I'm not a preaching professor, but I'd say that's pretty pathetic. But here's the deal. That didn't stop God from using it. In fact, the very next verse says the Ninevites believed in God. Meaning God used that half-hearted, poorly crafted, cynically given message to change people's lives. Now, I'm not advocating that you take Jonah's approach. In fact, the book of Jonah is mostly about how not to talk to people. What I'm saying is that sharing the good news of Jesus is not about having powerful words. It's about trusting a powerful God who is only asking you to tell people what you've seen him do. Now, I know, this step brings up a lot of what ifs. Like, what if people think less of me? Or what if I say it wrong? What if they don't take me seriously? But you know, there are some other what ifs that are worth considering. Like, what if God changes that person's life? Or what if that conversation plants a seed that leads to faith in Jesus? You see, the most important part of sharing what God has done in you is what God can do when the words are between your lips and their ears. It's what God can do when the words are between your lips and their ears, and you don't have to manage that part. That's God's responsibility. So tell your story. Make it personal. Maybe God restored a relationship in your life. Tell the story. Maybe God healed you from an addiction. Tell the story. Maybe God's freed you from that guilt or that regret. Tell the story. Maybe God's miraculously healed you. Tell the story. The story of God working in your life is what starts the story of God working in someone else's life. Another way you can tell the story of what God has done in your life is just to invite someone to church. Not just so they can attend, but so they can see how God is using that community to change you. If you meet someone who just moved here, you can just say, hey, would you like to come to my church? Or if you know someone who's navigating a transition or a challenge in their life, you can say, hey, would you like to come to my church? Or if you know someone who's feeling the pressure of being a parent, just say, hey, would you like to come to my church? We have a kids program, so you can drop your kids off and then pick them up next Sunday. I'm just kidding about that part. You actually have to take them back with you. Another way you can invite someone into our community is through Alpha. Alpha is an experience here at North Shore that provides a safe and engaging way to have conversations about life and about God. And the best part, dinner is included. I mean, it's like sitting in first class. We actually have another Alpha experience starting this September. You can find out more about that at northshore.church/alpha. And by the way, telling the story of what God has done in your life isn't just helpful for that other person, it's actually really helpful for you. You see, when you share about God, something happens inside you. You get a little less self-absorbed. You discover a little more joy, a little more purpose. But you have to be willing to tell the story of what God has done. And not just because you're right and they're wrong, not because you're strong and they're weak, but because good news is always shareable. And God always, always, always does something really good with it, even if it's just a seed, even if it's just the first of many more conversations that are to come, or even if you never know what happens after that. See, we have to think seeds, not fruit. Think seeds, not fruit, because God can do a lot with just a little seed. A few weeks ago, our church said goodbye to one of our most beloved and faithful members and a really close friend of mine. He was so loved and respected that over 500 people came to his memorial service and hundreds more watched online. And you might think he gained all those friends by never risking offending anyone or saying the wrong thing, but just the opposite is true. He shared the story of what Jesus had done in his life with pretty much everyone he met, including all the doctors and nurses who were caring for him during his treatment. Before he died, I got an email from him asking me to pray for one of the nurses he had told about Jesus. She was assigned to his room for just 2 nights, but their conversations were so impactful, she left a full-page letter in his bag telling him how much joy he had brought her and how she hoped she'd be able to see him again. But if not, she said, I hope I will have the luxury of meeting you in heaven someday. And it got me thinking about how many people will be in heaven, at least in part, because my friend just told them about it. The good news that God so loved this world that he sent his son to give his life on a cross for you and for me. Which makes me wonder, how many people will be blessed by having a spiritual conversation with you or a spiritual conversation with me? Because how can they believe if they've never heard? And how can they hear unless someone tells them? Because how beautiful on the mountaintops or the coffee shops or on that Target run or in row 17 are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation. That news was shareable then, and friends, it's still shareable today, even in this hurting and hostile world. But you have to start more conversations and be willing to listen and find common ground and tell your story. And then let God do the rest. Think seeds, not fruit. I hope you'll take a risk this week and try it and see just how delightful it can be. Well, I think that means it's time to land this plane, so I'll see you when I get back. It's a long flight. Does anybody know when we're going to be landing?